The pan hissed with splattering oil, but the sound that startled everyone did not come from the kitchen. It was the muffled sob of someone struggling to breathe. Maya, the morning shift cook, hunched over the grill, her hands trembling as she tried to flip the burning meat. Sweat and tears streamed together down her cheeks, but no one lifted their head. No customer noticed. No colleague asked. A plate slipped from her grasp, crashing into the sink with a hollow clang, splitting in two. Maya did not react. Her reddened eyes looked as if they had long grown used to the world ignoring her when she shattered. At the counter, a man sat in silence. A cap pulled low, an old hoodie, a rough beard masking half his face. To the others, he was just a tired stranger waiting for coffee. But behind the old glasses, his eyes followed every movement. He saw Maya's fingers grip the panhandle so tightly they turned white. He saw her frail shoulders quiver, holding back a scream. And in that moment he knew. The thing breaking was not the plate. It was the spirit of this woman. His name was Adrian Cole. No one in the bistro knew. To them, he was a stranger. But outside, on the sign that read Harbor and Hearth Bistro, every letter marked the dream Adrian had built with his burned hands years ago. He was the founder, the CEO, the man who once started with a food cart in the freezing rain. And tonight, he had returned in silence. Adrian had endured sleepless nights by the grill, had begged for coins to survive one more day. He knew the suffocating grip of loneliness, but over time, between meetings with investors and growth charts, he had lost the most important thing: the sound of the people breathing life into his dream. One short complaint had haunted him for weeks. The cook was crying. 5 words, enough to make him abandon the reports, slip on an old jacket, and walk into the branch that had once been his pride, Unit B14 at Union Station. The place where he had made his first sandwich. A place now so distant that even he barely recognized it. He entered as an anonymous customer, ordering a black coffee and the signature sandwich. Theo, the young cashier, did not even look up. His voice was flat, detached. 9:20. No smile, no thank you. When another customer complained their food was cold, he only shrugged. I just work here. That apathy had been labeled poor behavior in reports. But Adrian saw in his fleeting glance not insolence, but the guarded reflex of someone cornered too many times. Maya was different. She did not act careless. She fought until her body gave out. One hand flipping meat, the other cracking eggs. Hair plastered to damp cheeks, her hands raw from the heat, still forcing herself to finish every plate. Her lips moved with a whisper like a prayer. Just a little more. Almost done. No one heard. No one replied. At the corner, Ruth, the older waitress, with streaks of gray in her hair, moved slowly among the tables. She wrote nothing down, memory replacing paper. She remembered who wanted extra sugar, who always asked for a slice of lemon. With a gentle smile, she eased tempers with a simple apology. Never once a complaint. Yet her name never appeared in any report. She was like an old chair, sturdy, essential, but invisible. Adrian watched the 3 of them. A young man misunderstood, a cook on the verge of collapse, and a woman quietly keeping the place standing. Shame pressed hard into his chest. What had he built that left these people working and suffering in such isolation? He pulled a notebook from his pocket and wrote a single line, the one we can't afford to lose. But he left it nameless, because he knew it was not only Maya, not only Ruth, it was all of them. It looked like an ordinary morning shift. But under the weary fluorescent light, Adrian saw clearly. What was rotting was not profit. It was the soul of the brand he once believed in. And in that moment, sitting as a stranger in his own restaurant, he swore. The truth would be uncovered, no matter how painful. The clatter of knives on cutting boards, the stacking of dishes, the sighs of customers, all of it blended into a chaotic symphony. But within that noise, Adrian heard something else. Whispers. Whispers spoken quietly, yet weighted with truth. At the register, a customer muttered, "Where's the manager? Been waiting forever." Theo, the cashier, shrugged, his voice flat. "Rick? Probably still asleep. He rarely shows up before 10. The words slipped out casually, but they struck Adrian's heart like a stone. Moments later, another employee murmured just loud enough for the one beside him to hear. "He doesn't need to worry. His uncle's on the board. Rick's untouchable." Adrian sat still, his eyes narrowing behind his old glasses. Untouchable? In the company he had built, there was someone above the rules? He kept watching. Customers complained about cold food. No one addressed it. Ruth hurried to clean up tables. Maya kept her head down at the grill, her hands red from burns. But Rick? Nowhere to be found. The man in charge of the shift? Missing. At a window table, a couple whispered, their voices tinged with unease. "I heard a girl got fired just for calling in sick once." "Yeah, Rick kicked her out. No warning, no discussion, just erased her from the schedule like she never existed." The words dragged Adrian back to when he was 24, shivering in the rain, flipping pancakes for spare change, clinging to another day of survival. He had sworn his employees would never be treated as disposable, yet now, in his own restaurant, cruelty had become an unspoken policy. Every whisper led to the same name, Rick. He was a phantom over the entire store, never present, yet commanding fear and silence. Adrian scribbled in his notebook, "If this man still has a job, what the hell have I built?" Then a spark ignited the breaking point. A woman shoved her cold sandwich back across the counter, her voice sharp. "This is your signature dish? It's stone cold." Theo, face still empty, muttered back, "I don't cook. Ask the kitchen." Maya heard, her hand trembling as the tongs slipped, nearly crashing to the floor. Her lips moved like a prayer. "Just 5 minutes. I need 5 minutes." The reply came cold from the counter, sharp as salt pressed into a wound. "No one here has 5 minutes." Maya's hand went slack. The tongs hit the tile with a clatter. She turned to the wall, pressing her palms to the cold tile, forehead leaning against it, her whole body shaking in silence. This was not a pause. This was collapse. No one moved to her. Customers kept eating. Silverware clinked. Only Adrian stood frozen at the pass window, his body stiff. He saw it clearly. This was no longer a shift. It was a plea for help smothered into silence. A bead of sweat slid down Maya's cheek, dropping onto the hot grill, hissing as it evaporated. A small sound, but loud enough to awaken something buried deep in Adrian. The part of him that once cried behind an old food cart with no one noticing. His chest tightened. His hand clenched around the notebook until they trembled. Thousands of reports and statistics had never written this line. Your cook cried, and no one cared. In that moment, Adrian understood. This was no longer about one restaurant. It was proof, raw and unshakable, of the rot he had allowed to grow. He drew a deep breath, closed the notebook, and stood tall. No longer an anonymous customer, no longer a distant founder. From this moment, he was a witness, and ready to confront it. The back door slammed open, crashing against the wall with a hollow thud. The already tense atmosphere froze solid. Heavy footsteps struck the tiles like hammers on stone. A man appeared. His white shirt was wrinkled, the top button undone, a tie draped loosely around his neck. Sunglasses still covered half his face despite being indoors. A phone was clutched in his hand, his eyes glued to the screen, fingers tapping non-stop. He didn't glance at staff or customers. Rick. His presence hit like a storm. Theo immediately dropped his gaze, hurriedly stacking dirty glasses to appear busy. Ruth quietly retreated toward the coffee station, shoulders drawn in, eyes averted. The whole store seemed to shrink back, a reflex born of habit. Rick stopped in the center of the kitchen, his smoker's rasp edged with arrogance. "What's going on here? Who's whining this time?" Maya flinched, swiping at her tears with her sleeve, bending over the grill as though the motion could erase her fear. Her hand shook so badly that a spoon slipped to the floor. A small sound, but in the suffocating silence it rang like a confession. Rick sneered. "You again, Maya? If you can't handle it, quit. We don't carry the weak here." Adrian stood by the pass window, his heart pounding. For a moment he considered staying quiet, clinging to his role as the anonymous customer. But when he saw Maya bowing, shoulders hunched as though bracing for an invisible blow, Adrian knew the time for pretending was over. Rick finally noticed him and scowled. "Customer, what are you doing in the kitchen? This isn't a tour. Get out now." The room held its breath. Ruth lifted her eyes, a flicker of hope sparking. Theo froze mid-motion, still clutching a glass, wide-eyed. Maya kept her face hidden behind the counter, her shoulders trembling. Adrian didn't move. He slowly placed his notebook on the steel counter, every motion deliberate. His gaze rose behind the old glasses, locking straight on Rick. "Do you know who I am?" Rick chuckled dismissively. "Don't care. I run this place. Get out, or I'll call security." Adrian calmly drew his wallet from his pocket, not hurried, not rushed. He opened it and pulled out a card, holding it level with Rick's eyes. The fluorescent light gleamed on the embossed letters. Adrian Cole, founder and CEO, Harbor and Hearth Bistro. In that moment, the room exploded in silence. Rick froze, his eyes wide behind the glasses, his grip loosening so much his phone nearly dropped. Theo let the glass slip from his hands. Ruth stood motionless, her lips parted in shock. Maya lifted her head, her tear-stained eyes fixed on him. Adrian removed his glasses. For the first time, they saw his true face. Not a nameless stranger, but the founder, the owner of it all. His voice rang out, not loud, but heavy enough to split the air. "You just tried to throw me out of my own kitchen," Rick stammered, scrambling to salvage his authority. I didn't know. If you'd warned me," Adrian cut him off, his eyes cold as steel. "Exactly. You didn't know. Because you thought no one would check. Because you believed your uncle could shield you. Because you thought this was your kingdom." The silence was absolute. Even the sizzle of the grill seemed to fade. Adrian stepped closer, his voice sharp as a blade. "You're fired. Effective immediately. No negotiation." Rick stood rooted, his face twisting from arrogance to panic, then to rage. He growled, "You're making a huge mistake. Do you know who my uncle is?" Adrian placed a hand over his chest, steady. "I know who signs your paycheck, and it's not your uncle. It's me." The room broke open. Ruth dropped her cloth, her eyes brimming. Theo straightened, inhaling deeply as if breathing freely for the first time in months. Maya covered her mouth as tears slid down, not from exhaustion this time, but from seeing justice made real before her. Rick swallowed hard, his face drained. With no way back, he clenched his jaw, shoved his shoulders, and stormed out. The back door slammed, reverberating like a sentence passed. No cheers followed. No applause. Only a new kind of silence, clean, light. For the first time in years, the kitchen breathed fresh air. Adrian turned to Maya. His eyes softened, his voice quiet but weighty. You don't have to stand alone anymore. When the door slammed shut, the kitchen sank into a strange kind of silence. There were no more shouts, no more heavy breaths from a man ruling by fear. But this silence was not empty. It was clean, like a long exhale finally released. Adrian stood tall, his eyes sweeping across the kitchen that felt both familiar and foreign. He saw Ruth slowly set down a glass, her aged hands trembling but her eyes shining as though she dared to believe again. He saw Theo frozen behind the counter, lips pressed tight, eyes wide like a boy who had just witnessed lightning strike. And he saw Maya, still leaning against the stove, her small shoulders curled inward, crying as she struggled to breathe. No one spoke at first. Then Ruth asked softly, her voice trembling but steady, You really stay? Adrian turned toward her, removing the old cap from his head. A faint smile tugged at his lips. I've stayed away from this kitchen for too long. It's time I came back. Ruth nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, but her smile breaking through, gentle and proud. Adrian stepped toward Theo. The young man immediately lowered his head, his voice choking. I'm sorry for what I said to Maya. I didn't mean it. I just got used to living this way. Adrian held his gaze, not with anger, but with the weight of responsibility. You've repeated what Rick planted here, believing that strength means being cold, that survival means letting others drown. But true survival is making sure no one falls alone. The words pierced through Theo's hardened shell. His lips quivered, though no reply came, only his eyes glistening as the weight shifted. Adrian turned to Maya. She still trembled, one hand gripping her arm as if letting go would make her collapse. He walked to the sink, washed his hands, and rolled up his sleeves. No grand speech, only simple, deliberate action. Do you remember the recipe for the first sandwich this place ever made? He asked, his voice low and steady. Maya looked up, her swollen eyes suddenly breaking into a ragged laugh. I know it, but I bet I can make it better than you now. Adrian nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting. He took the pan and set it on the stove. His hand, once calloused and scarred, now trembled slightly with emotion. Maya stood beside him, tossing 2 slices of bread onto the grill. The kitchen watched as a millionaire CEO and a weary cook worked side by side as colleagues. The rhythm was different now, no longer frantic and suffocating, but steady, deliberate. Maya handed him butter. He passed her a slice of cheese. Everything moved without words. The sizzle of the pan rose again, but this time it was not the harsh sting of pressure. It was warm, like the opening notes of a song. Ruth stood watching, clutching her towel, her eyes glistening. Theo slowly loosened his grip on the glass, letting out a breath as though for the first time in months. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the air itself seemed filled with a new energy, hope. Adrian plated the sandwich and slid it toward Maya. Yours. From now on, you won't be cooking alone. Maya looked at the dish, then at him. Her first smile of the day broke through, imperfect, but real. In that moment, he was not the CEO, not the founder, not the disguised customer. He was simply another human being who had once been exhausted, once cried alone in a cold kitchen, now standing beside someone else to say, I understand, and I'm here. Silence filled the room once more, but this time, it did not weigh down. It was like the long breath released after being held too tightly for too long. The smell of toasted bread and smoked bacon filled the kitchen, but what lingered in the air was no longer exhaustion. It was the rhythm of something new. Maya's hands no longer trembled, steadier now as she passed ingredients. Theo still kept his head lowered, but his shoulders no longer sagged as heavily as before. Only Ruth remained, the silver-haired woman walking slowly with her old dish towel in hand. She stood by the wooden counter, her eyes resting on Adrian for a long moment, as if weighing whether or not to speak. At last, her voice broke the silence, low and warm. "Mr. Cole, do you know who I used to be?" The question caught Adrian off guard. Maya lifted her head. Theo stared in surprise. Ruth smiled faintly, without bitterness, as if recalling a distant memory. 4 years ago, I was a regional manager for this chain. I sat in offices, wore suits, held reports, attended weekly meetings. But then my husband was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I stepped back to the front lines, so I could stay close to home, close to the hospital. I wanted more time with him. Her voice faltered. Silence followed. Adrian's hand clenched, a sharp ache rising in his chest. "He passed a year later," Ruth continued, her eyes carrying a calmness that was almost unfathomable. "I could have gone back to the office, but I didn't want to. I didn't want cold hallways or soulless reports. Here, in this small kitchen, I can see the customers. I can remember who takes their coffee without sugar or who asks for a slice of lemon. I hear the laughter of children tugging at their mother's hands. Here, I feel life." Maya stood frozen, her eyes wide. Theo whispered, almost to himself, "I never knew, no one ever told me." Ruth shrugged gently, her smile soft. "Because no one needed to know. I'm not here to prove value. I stayed because I remember why this work matters." Adrian drew a deep breath. Every word Ruth spoke cut into him like a blade. For years he had sat in boardrooms, forgetting that some people chose to remain, not because they could not rise higher, but because they knew where true worth was rooted. He looked at Ruth, his voice unsteady but clear. "You kept this place from collapsing. Not the numbers, not Rick, not me. You." Ruth shook her head. "I only did what felt right. But I will be honest. You have been absent for too long, and we grew used to not being heard." The words landed like a hammer. Maya dropped her gaze. Theo bit his lip. Adrian stood still, offering no defense, no excuse. He let the silence close in, because he knew it was the naked truth. From outside, the sound of a customer calling an order pulled them back to the present. Ruth straightened her apron and returned to wiping tables. Maya rushed back to the grill, Theo to the register. Only Adrian remained where he was, his forehead damp with sweat, not from the heat, but from facing a truth more bitter than Maya's exhaustion. He had allowed good people to become invisible. He opened his notebook, writing each word with care. Do not mistake silence for smallness. Often it is the strength that keeps the system standing. Closing it, his eyes found Ruth, carrying both gratitude and regret. And in that moment, Adrian made a vow. No one like Ruth would ever stand unseen in the shadows again. The smell of toasted bread and bacon filled the kitchen, but what hung in the air was not exhaustion anymore. It was the rhythm of survival. Maya stood at the center of the storm, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling, her breath uneven. She had worked for hours without a sip of water. Her movements were still precise but growing slower, heavier. Plates piled on plates, meat burned onto the grill. Customers outside banged their spoons against tables in frustration. Adrian watched from the pass window. He saw Maya whisper to herself, "Just one more dish, just a little more." But her legs buckled. Carrying a tray of bread, her knees gave way. The plate slipped, the tray wobbled. She clenched her jaw, fighting to steady it, but her hands shook so badly her entire body trembled. "Hurry up! This food's cold already!" a customer shouted from outside. Theo's voice followed, loud and impatient. "Maya, 2 more bacon orders, now!" The words hit like a hammer. Maya forced herself back to the grill, but her strength was gone. The knife slid from her fingers. She gasped, her vision blurred. Ruth rushed toward her, but too slowly. Everything happened in a flash. Maya tipped forward, the tray swaying. In that moment, Adrian stepped in, catching the tray with one hand, steadying her elbow with the other. "Enough!" His voice was low but commanding, sharp as steel. The kitchen froze. Maya's red-rimmed eyes widened, her chest heaving. She tried to protest. I'm fine. Just a little more." Adrian shook his head, his gaze firm yet warm. "No, you're not fine. And no one should ever have to be like this." He set the tray down and gently slid the spoon from her hand. Maya stared at her empty palm, her lips trembling, afraid she would be seen as weak. Adrian held her gaze. "Maya, endurance isn't pushing yourself until you collapse. Endurance is knowing when to let someone else hold you up. You don't have to fight alone anymore." For a moment, Maya could not speak. Tears welled, not from shame, but because, for the first time, someone had said it aloud. She nodded slightly, as if releasing the burden she had carried too long. Theo stood frozen, gripping the counter, torn between guilt and realization. Ruth's eyes glistened, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Adrian turned to Theo, his voice sharp. "Do you see? This isn't just work. This is people." When she said she needed 5 minutes, that wasn't weakness. That was her limit, and if we ignore it, we are the ones pushing her over the edge. Theo lowered his head, his hands trembling. He wanted to argue, but all that came out was, I didn't see it. I thought everyone had to fend for themselves, like me." Adrian stepped closer, laying a hand on his shoulder, his tone softer. "I used to think that too, but the truth is no one survives alone. If you want to truly survive, then learn to keep others from falling." The words rang inside Theo like a bell. He swallowed back tears and nodded. Maya sat on a stool near the grill, her breath still ragged. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. Ruth placed a glass of water into her hands. Adrian rolled up his sleeves, turning toward the stove. "I'll take this shift. I used to be a cook, and now I'll start again, beside you." He grabbed a pan, the smell of grease rising as his hand moved with practiced rhythm. A millionaire CEO was back on the line, cooking as he had in his youth. The kitchen went silent, not with doubt, but with awe. They saw it. He wasn't just speaking. He was doing. In that moment, power no longer lived in a title, but in action. And everyone knew a new chapter had just begun. The oil sizzled and popped, the scent of melting butter and hot meat filling the kitchen. But this time it was not the sound of tension. It was rhythm. The rhythm of 2 people standing side by side. Adrian tilted the pan, flipping the bacon crisp and golden. His movements were steady and sure, as though he had never left the kitchen in decades. Maya worked next to him, her eyes still swollen from tears but her hands no longer trembling. She chopped vegetables, arranged ingredients. For the first time in months, she was not alone before the fire. Theo stood at the counter, staring into the kitchen. He could not believe what he was seeing. The founder, the man he had only read about in news stories, now standing beside Maya, preparing meals like any other line cook. Theo's hands clenched, shame mixing with a restless spark. He realized he had been wrong, and a chance to make it right was unfolding in front of him. From the corner, Ruth watched silently. She polished a glass, her eyes fixed on the scene. She had seen countless managers bark orders without ever lifting a hand on the hot line. But Adrian was different. He did not need to prove who he was. He let his hands speak. "Pass me the cheese," Maya murmured. Without looking, Adrian slid the slice of cheese across the stainless counter at the exact moment she set the bread on the pan. Their movements matched as if they had practiced for years. Maya's breathing steadied. A faint smile tugged at her lips, small but true. Adrian caught it, his chest tightening. After so many years of running the business, he had forgotten that sometimes a smile on an employee's face was worth more than any growth report. Outside, customers began to notice. Some peered through the pass window, glimpsing a strange sight, the owner in an old hoodie flipping sandwiches while the morning cook was shielded at his side. They did not understand, but they felt it. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. Adrian turned to Theo, his voice firm. "You, into the kitchen. Bring the greens." Theo jolted. "Me? But—" "No buts. If you want to know what it feels like when your teammate is pushed to the edge, step into the heat yourself." The words rang, stern but not scolding. Theo hesitated, then left the counter and walked into the kitchen. He handed Maya the basket of vegetables, his eyes meeting hers, weary but resolute. He whispered, "I'm sorry for before." Maya froze, then gave a small nod. No lecture, no anger, just a nod, enough for forgiveness. Ruth smiled, her eyes shining. She saw something forming, not just a team, but a family. Adrian flipped another sandwich, placed it neatly on a plate, and slid it through the pass window. The customer who had complained earlier took a bite, paused, then nodded in quiet approval. The complaint was gone, replaced by surprise. In the kitchen, Adrian spoke softly, like a vow. "From now on, we will cook not only to fill stomachs, but to make sure everyone in this kitchen truly lives. No one will be left behind." No one answered, but the weight of his words was felt by all. Maya gripped her knife tighter. Theo stood taller. Ruth polished another glass, her smile glowing. The kitchen no longer trembled. It began to breathe, the breath of unity, of people who knew they had stepped out of the shadows and that a new fire was being lit. The afternoon moved slower than usual. There were no more shouts, no more heavy footsteps from Rick, and though the air inside the bistro had softened, it still carried an undercurrent of tension. Adrian wiped his hand, still faintly smelling of smoke and grease, and lifted his gaze to meet Ruth's. The older woman leaned against the counter, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. She did not speak at once. She simply watched him, as if weighing whether the CEO would truly listen, or if he would disappear again as so many had before. Finally, Ruth set down her towel, her voice low but resolute. "Mr. Cole, there's something I have never told anyone here." Adrian nodded, saying nothing. Maya and Theo lifted their eyes, waiting. Ruth drew a long breath, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the present. "I once sat in the chair of a regional manager. I had an office, a nameplate, staff reporting directly to me. People greeted me by title. But when my husband was diagnosed with late-stage cancer, I asked to step back to the front line. I wanted to be near the hospital, near him. I didn't want to lose more time wandering cold hallways. Maya's eyes widened, whispering, I never knew that. Ruth smiled faintly, the lines on her face carrying pain long since settled into calm. Because no one asked, and no one cared. After he passed, I chose to stay here, not because I had failed, not because I couldn't go back to the office, but because here I saw real people. The parent walking their child to school, the laborer drinking black coffee before the shift. I remembered their faces, their stories. That was what I chose. Theo bit his lip, shame clouding his eyes. He had thought Ruth was just a slow, invisible old waitress. Now he saw her for what she was, a quiet warrior who had kept the flame burning for this place all these years. Adrian listened, his chest tightening. He remembered board meetings where everything was numbers, charts, percentages. He realized those numbers never captured a truth. Some people chose to stay, not because they lacked ambition, but because they were strong enough to protect what truly mattered. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. You are not small, Ruth. You did what I never had the courage to do. You stayed to preserve the heartbeat of this company. Ruth's eyes met his, not accusing, but sharp as a blade. But you have been gone too long. We learned to live without being heard, and that silence is what allowed men like Rick to grow. The words landed like a hammer. Maya lowered her face, her hand tightening on the knife. Theo stepped back slightly, stung by the truth. Adrian did not defend himself. He stood and accepted the weight of it, because he knew it was real. The silence stretched on. Then Ruth bent down, picked up her towel, and resumed her work as if nothing had been said. But they all knew the air had changed. Adrian opened his notebook and wrote slowly, carefully. Do not mistake silence for weakness. There are people who quietly keep the whole system from collapsing. They are the backbone. He closed the book and lifted his eyes toward Ruth with respect. For the first time in years, he understood what true leadership looked like. Not the person seated above, but the one who stands behind everyone else, holding them up so they do not fall. And Adrian swore that never again would quiet leaders like Ruth be left invisible in the shadows. The afternoon settled over Union Station as waves of people flooded into the bistro. Orders piled up. The service bell rang constantly, and the kitchen was once again drowning in pressure. Maya stood on the hot line, forcing herself to move like a machine. Knife chopping, pan flipping, bread sliding across the grill. But from the dark circles under her eyes and her ragged breathing, Adrian knew her body had already crossed its limit. He watched in silence. Every movement seemed to drag a heavier burden across her shoulders. Plates stacked like a mountain, the smell of burning clung to the air. Her hands shook, her fingers red from the heat. Out front, Ruth masked her unease with a soft smile, while Theo bit his lip, watching Maya as though he wanted to speak but couldn't. Then came the breaking moment. Maya carried a tray of fresh sandwiches to the pass window. Her knees buckled, the tray tipped, plates sliding. She caught herself on the stainless counter, her eyes glazed, her lips whispering, I'm fine. I just need a little. But her body betrayed her. The tray tilted fully. Maya staggered, about to collapse. Adrian moved instantly. One hand steadied the tray, the other gripped her arm, holding her upright. The crash echoed, but the food never hit the floor. Everyone, staff and customers alike, turned. Time seemed to stop. His voice rang out, each word firm and unshakable. No, you are not fine. And no one should have to pretend they are fine when they are breaking. Maya's swollen eyes widened, staring at him in disbelief. Tears spilled, mingling with the salt of sweat. She whispered, trembling, "But if I stop, who will finish the rest?" Adrian set the tray down, turning to face the staff. Ruth stood frozen, Theo's fists clenched. Others peered nervously from the prep counter. Adrian's voice cut through the room. If a restaurant survives by grinding down its people, then that restaurant deserves to collapse. But this place will not be one of them. The tension cracked. Ruth nodded, her eyes glistening. Theo let go of the counter, stepping forward, stammering, I'll do it. Give it to me." Maya looked at him in shock. Theo yanked on gloves, fumbling through the motions of stacking lettuce and laying meat. His technique was clumsy, but his eyes burned with determination. Ruth left the tables, tied on an apron, and carried a tray to the dining room. Her smile was gentle, but her voice rang steady. "We share this, Maya. You will not carry it alone anymore." Maya collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. The sobs broke free, unstoppable. But this time, it was not the cry of despair. It was the cry of someone finally seen, finally allowed to be fragile. Adrian sat beside her, his voice softening. "You have kept this kitchen alive for too long. From now on, let us keep you." Maya lowered her hand, her eyes still wet but glimmering with a faint light. She nodded, the first time she did not resist. Out front, customers watched in silence, bearing witness to something they had never seen. A team standing together, an owner working the line, a broken cook supported instead of scolded. And they felt it. This was no longer just a restaurant. It was a place where people were truly seen. Adrian turned to the staff, his voice carrying like a declaration. "From today, we will not work just to survive. We will work to live and to hold each other up." The sound of the grill rose again, but this time it was not the sound of pressure. It was the rhythm of a new beginning. Night fell over Union Station. Neon lights glowed against dusty glass, reflecting weary faces in the kitchen that, despite exhaustion, still carried a spark. The final shift had ended, the customers gone, leaving behind only the clatter of silverware in the sink and the hum of the vent fans. Adrian sat at a small table in the corner of the bistro, a notebook laid out before him. Not a sleek laptop, not financial reports. Just a napkin, a ballpoint pen, and rough lines of writing. He scribbled, crossed out, and wrote again, each word pressing against his heart like a strike. Maya sat across from him, a jacket draped over her shoulders, her eyes still red from crying. Ruth stood beside them, arms crossed, no longer just a silent waitress, but a mentor in presence. Theo lingered by the counter, silent, yet his eyes brimmed with expectation. Adrian looked up, his voice steady and low. "We don't need another memo. We don't need more directives from an office. What we need is a rebirth." He set the napkin on the table. On it, the words were clear. "Change does not come from PowerPoint. It comes from people." Maya looked at it, shaking her head gently. "I'm just a cook. What could you possibly expect from me?" Adrian leaned forward, his eyes glowing in the dim light. "It's because you are just a cook that I need you. You endured this place in silence and still stood tall. That is not weakness. That is strength." Ruth laid a hand on Maya's shoulder, her voice calm but certain. "You don't even see it, Maya. You've been leading for a long time. No one ever gave you the title." Maya lowered her eyes, her fingers brushing the edge of the napkin. A fragile but real seed of belief stirred within her. Adrian turned to Ruth, his voice carrying the weight of a decision already made. "You are not a waitress. You are the keeper of this culture. I want you to lead the regional training program, not because of a title, but because you know how to listen." Ruth was silent for a long moment. In her aged eyes there was both pain and pride. Finally, she nodded softly and whispered, "I will do it, but not for position. I will do it so no one else ever has to live as invisible as I once did." Theo shifted nervously, then blurted out, And what about me?" All three turned to him. The young man swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "I know I was wrong, but I want to learn. I don't want to become another Rick. I want to change." Adrian's gaze held him, stern yet not cold. "You will learn. But remember this. A second chance is for making things right, not for repeating mistakes." Theo nodded hard, his eyes alive with determination. Adrian pulled out his phone and typed quickly. Minutes later, every employee in the system felt their phones vibrate with a notification. "We will not change through reports. We will change by truly seeing each other. No shift hours will be cut in silence. All past complaints will be reviewed. Those who have kept the store standing will guide the next generation. I do not ask for love. I only ask for trust, if I prove worthy." The message spread instantly across every location. Employees read it on their small screens, their hearts racing, because for the first time they saw a CEO admit he had been wrong and promised to correct himself. In the kitchen, Maya whispered, "Is this real? Will it really be different this time?" Adrian answered, his voice steady as stone. "It will, because this time we begin again with people, and I am here. I am not leaving." A cool breeze drifted through the door frame, carrying with it the faint scent of baked bread. 4 people sat together in the small kitchen, no longer just boss and employees, but companions. And in that silence, a true revolution began. The next morning, Union Station was once again filled with noise. Travelers pulled their suitcases, announcements echoed calling the next train. But inside Unit B14, the atmosphere had changed. Maya stood at the hotline, her hands steadier now, her eyes no longer red from tears but bright with determination. Ruth wore her apron, standing calmly like a lighthouse, her presence enough to make the whole team feel safe. Theo worked behind the counter, but this time he lifted his head, meeting customers with a smile. Adrian sat quietly at a corner table, watching it all. He wasn't taking notes. He wasn't giving orders. He simply observed and smiled. Because he knew the company had finally found its breath again. Not because of a marketing campaign. Not because of revenue reports. But because of the people who once seemed small, but in truth, were the heart of the entire system. He thought of Maya, who cried in silence, yet still cooked each meal for customers. He thought of Ruth, who walked away from an office to preserve the core values of service. He thought of Theo, the young man who once hid fear behind indifference, now learning to protect his teammates. Adrian realized leadership was not about sitting above and making decisions. Leadership was about seeing. Seeing the sweat on someone's forehead, seeing the cries for help that went unanswered, seeing the resilience hidden in trembling hands. A restaurant can survive because of its menu, but it can only truly live because of its people. And if those people are treated as disposable, the brand will slowly die in silence. Now, the silence in the bistro was no longer fear. It was peace. A deep breath after years of suffocation. Adrian stood and walked toward the kitchen. He made no grand announcement. He simply tapped the stainless counter, drawing everyone's attention. His eyes moved across each of them, his voice low and warm. I once believed the most important thing was profit. I was wrong. The most important thing is all of you, the people who keep this place alive. From today, we are not building a company, we are building a home. Maya bowed her head, lips pressed tight, but her eyes burned with fire. Ruth nodded, her smile radiant with pride. Theo inhaled deeply, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. This story is not about a CEO firing a bad manager. It is the story of a man relearning how to lead, not with a balance sheet, but with his heart. And it is a reminder to us all, the most valuable thing in any organization is never the product. It is the people. In business, people often speak of strategy, market share, and profit. But the deeper truth is this: a company is not measured by the numbers on a report, but by how it treats the people who quietly carry the weight each day. Culture is not born in a boardroom. It is written in the sweat on the hot line, in the gentle smile of a server, in the patience of those whose names are never called. A CEO may lose reputation if he looks only at profit, but he will rediscover his true legacy when he chooses to bow his head, to listen, and to stand beside his employees. That is the strongest and most enduring power, the power of people. If you believe that every company, every team, must learn to truly see one another as this story shows, press like and subscribe so you won't miss the inspiring journeys ahead. And leave a short comment, just 2 words, but strong enough to hold today's message. See each other.